The wind screamed through the skeletal frame of Hangar 14, rattling loose panels and hissing through broken windows. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing like dying insects, casting long, warped shadows across the cracked concrete floor. Airman First Class Sarah Delgado walked slowly through the gloom, her boots echoing hollowly in the vast space. Her flashlight beam wavered as she scanned the corners, half hoping to find nothing. The base had been dying for weeks. Its silence was not peaceful, but heavy. The kind of quiet that felt watched. She paused near the rusted shell of an old maintenance platform. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, an instinct she had learned not to ignore. Then, she heard it, boots. Not hers. A measured cadence, deliberate, coming from behind. She turned sharply, the flashlight slicing through the dark. Nothing. Her breath quickened. She pressed her radio to her mouth, voice tight. "This is Delgado, Sector 3. I'm not alone out here." A burst of static answered. Then silence. Then, not silence. The hiss of the radio deepened, warped, and from it emerged a whisper, too close, too clear to be static. It was not a voice she recognized, not from the base, not from this world. "You shouldn't be here," it said, barely audible, like a breath inside her skull. Delgado's hand trembled as she lowered the radio, backing toward the hangar doors. The footsteps had stopped. The air grew colder, biting through her uniform. And then, a touch. Fingers like ice brushed the back of her neck, soft, but deliberate. She spun around, flashlight swinging, her hand instinctively reaching for her sidearm. Nothing. No figure. No presence. Just the groan of the hangar structure and the wind howling louder now, as if it had sensed her fear and fed on it. Delgado stood frozen, pulse thudding in her ears. She was a trained security forces specialist, but no training prepared her for the feeling that something unseen was still standing right behind her, breathing softly in the dark. She backed away, never turning her back fully, until the red emergency exit light came into view. Even then, she hesitated. Some unseen part of her screamed that if she ran, it would chase her. But she had to move. Every nerve in her body was screaming now, not with adrenaline, but with something more primal. Fear that did not come from a rational place, but from the same ancient place that made children afraid of the dark. She reached the door, shoved it open, and stepped into the desert night. The wind was just as harsh outside, but out here, at least, she could breathe. Her hand went back to her radio, but she hesitated. That whisper, it was still in her mind. Delgado turned to look back at the hangar. The shadows seemed darker now, deeper, and somewhere in that unnatural stillness, she knew, whatever had touched her was still inside. Waiting. They called it stress. Routine burnout. The kind of fatigue that creeps in during long hours of isolation and watch duty. That is what the Air Force claimed when reports started piling up in the final weeks before George Air Force Base shut its gates for good. But hidden beneath those clinical assessments and sanitized briefings were files that someone tried very hard to bury. Airman First Class Sarah Delgado never spoke publicly. Not while she was in uniform. But 1 year after her discharge, a letter arrived at an investigative journalist's desk. No return address. No signature. Just a plain envelope containing photocopied pages, scribbled notes, and a line that read, "You do not see ghosts because you are tired." The pages included fragments of incident reports stamped top secret, many heavily redacted. But certain phrases slipped through the black bars: anomalous movement detected, non-thermal cold zones, psychological impact on isolated personnel, unauthorized transmission, origin unknown. And always, at the top, the date, October 1992. The final month of George Air Force Base's existence. Delgado's account was not the only one. Leaked testimonies from other airmen revealed patterns. Apparitions appearing along the old tarmac. Disembodied voices breaking through radios. Sudden drops in temperature. Lights flickering in buildings long since decommissioned. Equipment failing, then mysteriously resetting, often while showing recorded data from years earlier. As if the base itself was caught in some loop, replaying fragments of its own forgotten past. The Air Force dismissed it all. Internal memos chalked it up to stress, poor morale, sleep deprivation. Officers were told to reassure enlisted personnel and to control the narrative. But some airmen began to talk anyway, quietly, cautiously, in late-night conversations or hidden notes passed between bunkmates. They whispered about the hangars that no one wanted to patrol, about the figure in the flight suit seen wandering near the crash memorial, about radios that spoke with voices long dead. One testimony described a recording made by airman Tom Carver, a communications tech, who allegedly captured a voice repeatedly saying, "I never left." The file vanished after his disappearance. Delgado's letter hinted that the sightings, the whispers, the panic, they were not isolated incidents. She believed they were tied to something far older. An experiment. A secret buried beneath George Air Force Base decades before she ever walked its perimeter fence. She asked only one question in that letter, written in shaky, underlined pencil: why would they seal these reports, even from their own commanders? No one had an answer. But after the base closed, those documents disappeared from official archives. Requests under the Freedom of Information Act returned generic denials. And anyone who spoke publicly found themselves suddenly reassigned, discharged, or dismissed as delusional. But Delgado had kept one thing they could not erase: her memory. And her story was only beginning to surface. October 1992. The final autumn wind swept across the cracked runways of George Air Force Base, carrying dust, forgotten echoes, and the uneasy weight of endings. The sun dipped low over the Mojave Desert, bleeding red into the horizon, casting long shadows from the row of silent F-4 Phantom jets parked on the tarmac. Once a Cold War nerve center for tactical flight training, the base now felt more like a mausoleum, still occupied, but lifeless. Inside the command office, Colonel Robert Vance stood by the window, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the fading sky. His command, the 35th Tactical Fighter Wing, had been reduced to a skeleton crew, a mix of airmen finishing final inventories, security forces running perimeter checks, and maintenance teams tasked with wrapping up decades of hardware. The operations tempo had dropped, but the tension had not. If anything, it was worse now. Everyone felt it. Airman First Class Sarah Delgado had only been assigned to George 3 months earlier, and already the place had clawed into her nerves. Every patrol felt longer than it should. Every hallway at night carried an extra footstep. Lights flickered where no one had been. Radios clicked on with static, even when untouched. At first, Delgado wrote it off: old wiring, desert wind, end-of-shift jitters. But then others started talking. Not openly, but quietly, carefully. The base had a reputation. Not official, of course. Not something written in manuals or training slides. But the veterans said it. The ones who had been stationed there in the 70s and 80s. That George was cursed. That something had always been wrong with it. Staff Sergeant Michael Reed, head of the maintenance crew, had been there the longest. 12 years. When asked why he never transferred, he shrugged and said, someone had to stay behind and make sure it did not get worse. His men respected him. But even Reed was not immune to the whispers. This place was cursed long before we got here, he once told Delgado during a routine generator check. You could feel it in the air. Like the ground never forgot something bad happened. The records showed nothing out of the ordinary. But people remembered. Fatal crashes during training runs that never made the news. Pilots who spoke of seeing lights in the desert sky before vanishing entirely. An underground radar station that was supposedly sealed after a chemical leak, though no one could produce a report of it. And then there were the tests. No one knew exactly what was tested at George during the early Cold War years. Some said it was advanced flight systems. Others said electronic warfare. A few whispered about something tied to the mind. Delgado had found old blueprints of sealed sections of the base, buildings no longer marked on the official maps. When she brought it up during a briefing, Colonel Vance cut her off without explanation. The sun was gone now. The Mojave sky turned black above the airfield, and with it came the silence. That eerie, unnatural stillness that had become a part of life at George. Something was ending. But for those still inside the perimeter fence, something else felt like it was just beginning. It started small, easy to ignore, easier to explain. A light flickering in a locked supply shed. A door found wide open that was supposed to be sealed. Wrenches missing from toolkits, then mysteriously reappearing in different rooms. The kinds of things that get chalked up to forgetfulness, or boredom, or a prank someone is too proud to admit. But the patterns formed quickly. Too quickly to be random. By the second week of October, the night patrols at George Air Force Base began logging incidents with growing unease. Nothing major. Nothing threatening. But strange enough that even the most seasoned airmen began hesitating before turning down dark corridors alone. Sarah Delgado was among the first to write it down officially, a report of lights flickering in Hangar 6 despite the power being shut off. She checked the panel herself. She checked the breakers. Still, they blinked like someone was inside flipping the switches. 2 nights later, a security camera inside that same hangar captured something else. The footage stuttered. 1 second, the frame was empty. The next, a blurry silhouette, halfway across the floor. The figure was there for just a moment, and then gone. Not even long enough to call it a person. Just a shape. But it moved like it knew where it was going. Delgado asked for the footage. Colonel Vance denied the request. Said it was probably a technician walking through without logging their movement. Delgado checked the logbooks. No technician had been cleared into that sector. She checked the security roster. No airman had passed through that checkpoint. The voices came next. Radios started behaving strangely. Mid-patrol, airmen would hear static crackle through their headsets, followed by a voice, a broken, garbled phrase, like it was traveling through old tape. Then it would vanish. At first, Delgado thought it was a malfunction. She switched her unit. Then it happened again. Same voice. Same phrase. But this time, it said her name. Delgado. Help me. She froze. The voice was familiar, but twisted. Slowed. Distorted. She called for a frequency check. The channel she was using had not been active since 1979, one tied to a crash site outside the perimeter. When she asked Colonel Vance about the history of that frequency, he brushed it off and reminded her not to overthink things. His official stance became increasingly clear: heightened stress, nerves, pranks. That was all it was. But the airmen knew better. They spoke in hushed tones in the mess hall, glancing over their shoulders. Tools they placed down would move when no one was looking. They found cold pockets in the barracks that could not be explained by airflow or vent failures. And worst of all was the crying. Delgado heard it on her second patrol that week. A low, soft sob coming from inside Hangar 12. She checked it twice. The place was empty. Lights off. Doors locked. But she swore someone was in there, crying. Alone. When she told Staff Sergeant Reed, he looked at her and nodded. Not with disbelief, but with recognition. I checked that hangar twice. Empty, she whispered. So why did I hear someone crying inside? No one had an answer. But the patterns were forming. And every one of them pointed to the same conclusion: something was trying to reach them. Through the cracks in the signal. Through the weak points in the dark. At exactly 1 a.m. on October 15th, the atmosphere at George Air Force Base turned from uneasy to unexplainable. The fog rolled in thick and low across the runway, swallowing the desert in silence. It was not the usual mist stirred up by the Mojave chill. It crept in heavy, like it had purpose, like it was being pulled from the ground rather than falling from the sky. Security patrols had been doubled following the unexplained incidents earlier in the week. Radios were now monitored across multiple channels, and yet something still broke through. The first call came in sharp, violent, and without warning. Mayday, I'm hit. Eject, eject, Jesus, it's on fire. The voice was shrill, filled with panic, then cut off in a burst of static. The channel went dead. Delgado was in the control shack when it came through. She froze. The timestamp on the log read 1 a.m., but the frequency matched a long-retired band from the 1960s, one associated with a training squadron that had suffered a fatal crash over the desert. Before she could react, the alarms on the runway sensors began to chirp. Movement. Several airmen on night watch confirmed it too. Something, or someone, was on the tarmac. When Delgado stepped out into the fog with her flashlight raised, the light caught a figure standing in the mist. A man in a full flight suit. Helmet off. His face burned, grotesquely melted, but the uniform unmistakable, Air Force issue from 30 years ago. He was not walking. He was moving, in slow, deliberate steps down the center of the runway like he had just climbed out of a wreck. Delgado raised her voice. Identify yourself. No answer. Just the wind and that endless fog. Then the radios all across the base exploded with noise. Dozens of airmen scrambled from their posts as multiple radios began playing garbled, overlapping transmissions. Screams. Warning calls. Repeating crash coordinates. One voice, horribly clear, kept shouting, "I see the ground. I see the ground," followed by the sickening screech of tearing metal. It was a cockpit recording. A final transmission before impact. Inside the fog, Delgado's flashlight dimmed. The batteries, fresh at the start of the shift, now flickered like they were dying. She squinted into the distance, only to realize the figure was no longer walking. It was staring at her. Still. Silent. The burned pilot stood near the edge of Hangar 3, eyes locked with hers across the field. Not eyes, really, black hollows, leaking something darker than shadow. Delgado could not move. She could not think. For one terrible second, she felt as if he was inside her mind. "He looked right at me," she would later say. "Like he knew me. His eyes, they weren't human." And just as suddenly as it began, the fog lifted. No figure. No sound. The radios returned to silence. The base lights flickered back on. But the air remained poisoned by what they had seen and heard. From that moment on, no one questioned whether something was wrong with George Air Force Base. The question now was, what had they awakened? The fog had lifted, but the fear stayed behind. What happened on the runway changed everything. Routine was abandoned. Patrols were doubled, lights were left on in every hallway, and radios were monitored non-stop. But the tension kept building, like the air itself was waiting for something. The whisper of the base had become a voice, and that voice was growing louder. Airman Tom Carver, the night shift radio technician, had been on edge for days. He was the first to call what they were hearing ghost signals. The term caught on fast. It was easier to joke about than admit the truth, that the voices were becoming clearer. That someone, or something, was using old frequencies to speak. Carver stopped sleeping. He began logging transmissions that never appeared on the base recorders. Voices calling from long-dead squadrons. Aircraft IDs that were decommissioned decades earlier. Pilots crying out coordinates over desert ranges that no longer existed. At first, his supervisor told him to rest. To take a day. He refused. He said they were trying to tell him something. That they were trapped between signals, and only he could hear them. Then, one night, the tower went silent. At approximately 2 a.m., Carver's shift was supposed to end. But no one relieved him. The next tech arrived at 2:15 a.m. and found the door wide open. The control tower was empty. Coffee still warm. Headset lying on the floor. Still active. The headset played a single word on a loop, "Tom." Over and over. Whispered. Not broadcast. Just played, like someone had recorded it in real time. The voice never rose. It just repeated, and grew colder each time it said his name. Search teams were dispatched. Every corner of the control tower was swept, the roof, the stairwell, the ground below. Nothing. No blood. No signs of a fall. No signs of anything. It was like he had been erased. Delgado, acting on instinct, broke protocol and went through Carver's locker. What she found was worse than she expected. Hidden behind a layer of folded uniforms was a thin black notebook, his journal. Inside were pages of dense, obsessive writing. Sketches of a man in a burned flight suit. Notes about recurring dreams. Warnings. And again, the same phrase, "He wants help. But he is not human anymore." The pages became more erratic toward the end. Entire paragraphs scratched out. Ink pressed so hard it tore the paper. The final entry read, "He stands at the end of the runway every night. I cannot sleep. He is looking at me now." Staff Sergeant Michael Reed took the journal from Delgado without saying a word. Later, in a rare moment of honesty, he admitted, "Tom said he saw the pilot every night. I should have believed him." After Carver vanished, the tone on base shifted. No more jokes. No more eye-rolling. Every man and woman knew something was happening, and that it was only getting stronger. They stopped asking if it was real. Now, they were asking who would be next. By sunrise, The base was no longer under its own command. Black vans rolled in through the main gate without warning, moving in formation like a silent convoy of undertakers. They bore no unit markings, no visible plates, and the men who stepped out wore plain uniforms, no ranks, no names. Military police accompanied them, but even they seemed uneasy. No one greeted them. No one briefed the airmen. Within minutes, the orders came down from Colonel Vance himself. All non-essential operations were suspended until further notice. Every patrol, every log entry, every radio channel was now under strict lock. Hangar 7 was the first to be sealed. No explanation. Just chains, locks, and guards posted around the clock. Those who had been inside were pulled aside and interrogated separately. Delgado watched as 2 techs from Night Watch were walked out of the building, their faces pale, eyes wide. They said nothing. The rest of the crew was assembled in the briefing hall. Officers stood in front with clipboards. Men from the black vans stood in the back, silently watching. One by one, airmen were called into side rooms. Inside, they were handed papers, non-disclosure agreements. The message was clear: sign, or face immediate discharge and possible federal charges. No exceptions. Questions were not allowed. Delgado sat in the corner of the barracks later that afternoon, cradling her duffel bag and trying not to look suspicious. Inside the lining, stitched where no one would find it, was Carver's journal. She had hidden it moments after the first sweep. If they knew she had it, they would take it. And maybe worse. They took everything, she would later whisper. Our notes, our radios. Like they were erasing us. Staff Sergeant Reed had been called in for questioning twice. When he returned, he looked different, quieter, sharper around the edges. He would not say what they asked him. Only that he was told to forget what happened in the control tower. Delgado tried to press him. He looked at her and said, "You don't want to know what they think it is." Rumors moved like wildfire. Some said the men in black were from a Pentagon task force specializing in classified weapons tests. Others claimed they were from a branch of the Defense Intelligence Agency, trained in dealing with paranormal threats. A few thought it was just a cover, an effort to protect a Cold War secret that had finally gone too far. But the airmen who had seen the pilot, they knew better. Later that night, someone heard a scream echo from inside Hangar 7. Not a human scream, but something higher pitched. Twisted. It faded almost instantly. The guards did not flinch. After that, no one went near the hangar. The base was still operational on paper. But inside, George Air Force Base had become a place of silence. Not just the kind born of secrecy, but the kind that follows fear. A silence imposed by people in charge, not to protect lives, but to bury them. The official narrative came fast, cold, and clinical. A press briefing no one watched. A report no one read. The Air Force released a single-page summary citing fatigue, operational stress, and psychological misinterpretation of stimuli during base closure procedures. Words like hallucinations, equipment failure, and group panic were printed in bold across a heavily redacted file. The incidents at George Air Force Base, it claimed, were unfortunate, but not abnormal. No mention of Carver. No mention of the voices. Nothing about Hangar 7. Sarah Delgado refused to sign the non-disclosure agreement. She refused to admit that what she saw was imagined. Her commanding officer called her into his office one final time. Colonel Vance's face was hard, unreadable. He offered her a last chance, sign and walk away quietly. Delgado asked him if the thing in the fog had been real. His eyes dropped for only a second. That was enough. The next morning, Delgado was discharged. Insubordination was the reason printed on her record. She was gone before noon. No ceremony. No farewell. Just her duffel, her silence, and the stitched journal hidden deep inside it. Then something strange began to happen. Within days of her discharge, online forums discussing George Air Force Base started going blank. Archived photos disappeared. Posts vanished from public threads. Entire threads removed from digital history. Those who had shared rumors about the ghost pilot, the black vans, or the scream in Hangar 7 found their accounts suspended or wiped clean. Even Delgado's private messages to a military journalist were marked undeliverable. The digital trail was being erased. But Delgado had more than memory. She had Carver's journal, and a name buried inside it. A program designation, Project Echo Wire. After weeks of quiet digging, she connected it to a 1960s-era DARPA initiative, long buried beneath Cold War secrecy. It involved psychic enhancement in high-stress pilots, designed to sharpen decision-making through non-ordinary perception. Most of the tests had ended in psychological collapse. 1 fatal crash. 2 confirmed suicides. The program was supposedly dismantled in 1969. But Delgado believed George Air Force Base was one of the last test sites. A place where something had not just failed, but opened. A door that should have stayed closed. Leaked pages from a declassified briefing, sent anonymously to a retired Air Force technician, seemed to confirm it. One line, under a blacked-out project summary, read, "Residual field interference consistent with echolocation-based cognition." Another, "Subject still exhibiting anomalous sensory feedback years after cessation." In other words, something remained. Staff Sergeant Michael Reed was among the few who spoke out, long after his retirement. In a transcript that was quietly posted and deleted days later, he wrote, "They said it was in our heads. But ghosts do not leave footprints in the dust. And they do not know your name unless they have been watching you." Delgado never stopped chasing the truth. She moved apartments, switched phones, met with people in parking lots instead of offices. She kept the journal wrapped in canvas and buried in a box beneath her floorboards. Whatever had haunted George Air Force Base, it was not gone. It had simply followed her home. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of an old ceiling fan spinning overhead. A single lamp cast shadows across the peeling wallpaper. Sarah Delgado sat hunched in a worn armchair, her civilian jacket draped loosely over her shoulders, her fingers wrapped tightly around the weathered black notebook she had kept hidden since the day she left George Air Force Base. It was Carver's journal, the only proof she had that what happened out there was real. She had agreed to meet only under strict conditions. No names. No recordings outside the tape she brought. No cameras. Just a voice recorder and a promise that the story would be heard, whether anyone believed it or not. Her voice trembled as she spoke, not with fear, but exhaustion. Exhaustion born from carrying something too heavy for too long. She talked about the voices first, how they started faint, like static behind the words, then clearer, until they called her name with a familiarity that felt wrong. She described the figure she saw on the runway, the scorched pilot in the outdated flight suit, walking as if the crash that killed him had never ended. She remembered his face. Or what was left of it. She told the journalist about Carver's descent, how he heard things no one else could, how his dreams were filled with screaming engines and fire, how he vanished without leaving so much as a boot print. She opened the journal carefully, showing pages filled with frantic sketches of the pilot, each one more distorted than the last. Some looked like the man was burning alive. Others, like he was reaching through the page itself. Delgado paused before speaking again, her eyes locked on one sketch in particular. It showed a figure standing outside her window. The shading, the posture, the angle, it was her window. From her apartment. Drawn before Carver disappeared. "They opened something," she whispered. "That is what the project was really about. Not just pushing minds, but pushing through. Pushing beyond." She believed the program, whatever its real name was, had never been shut down. Only buried. Moved. Hidden under enough paper, fire, and silence to make people forget. But she had not forgotten. And something else had not either. She said it visits her sometimes. At night. In her dreams, mostly. But a few times she had seen it, just in the corner of her vision. Just outside her door. Once, standing across the street under the streetlight, not moving. Watching. "Every night, I see him," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "He's waiting for me to come back." The journalist pressed stop on the recorder. Delgado did not move. Her hands trembled slightly as she shut the journal and pulled her jacket tighter. There was no comfort in having survived George Air Force Base. The others had been silenced. But she had carried the memory, and now that memory was no longer just hers. The pilot was still out there. Decades have passed since George Air Force Base was officially deactivated. The gates are rusted now, the tarmac cracked and split by years of wind and sun. The desert has begun to reclaim the structures, ivy and sand creeping into the hangars, the barracks hollowed out by time. On paper, it is just another Cold War relic, left behind and forgotten. But not everyone believes it stayed quiet. In 2025, a group of urban explorers posted grainy footage online, scrubbed within hours but not before copies spread. In the video, a drone pans slowly over the base at dusk. As it moves across the central runway, something flickers in the feed. A figure. Motionless. A pilot, standing in full flight gear, his body blackened and still, face obscured. The drone jerks, the camera tilts, and the feed cuts to static. The clip was only a few seconds long, but enough to send whispers echoing across the internet. Forums resurrected old threads. New accounts began asking questions about what really happened in 1992. Some brought up Project Echo Wire. Others spoke of the DARPA files Delgado had hinted at, the ones involving remote cognition, psychic stress, and field anomalies that persisted long after shutdown. And then, the whispers started again. People claimed they heard voices while parked near the old perimeter fence. One explorer reported hearing an emergency broadcast over an old military radio, coordinates shouted over static, followed by a scream. No one else heard it. His recording? Corrupted. But his eyes told the story. Sarah Delgado never returned to George. But she still checks the feeds. She still watches the forums. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, her phone buzzes with no caller ID. Just silence. Sometimes static. Once, the message whispered, "You should not be here." Reed's private journal, smuggled out just before his death in 2008, contains a final chilling entry. It reads, "That base is not empty. Something is still there, and it remembers us. It does not forgive. And it does not forget." Theories swirl that the pilot was a manifestation of psychic trauma, a byproduct of an experiment gone too far. Others believe he is a remnant, not a ghost in the traditional sense, but a fracture in time, looping endlessly between the crash and whatever came after. A curse written into the soil itself. A warning stitched into radio waves and whispers. Whatever truth hides beneath the silence of George Air Force Base, it remains untouched. The gates may be locked, but the door, that door, was opened long ago. And some doors, once opened, never truly close.